Hello and welcome to the Global Solar Market Outlook 2023 webinar. I'm Vera, your moderator for today's session. As a senior editor at SolarBee, I have witnessed the rapid growth of the solar industry and the exciting developments that have emerged in recent years. As you join us today, we're excited to share with you the latest trends and advances in the international solar market. Our webinar will dive into various topics, including the latest advancements in solar technology, cost forecasting in the solar industry, global manufacturing, and demand forecast for major solar markets, and new module releases. Our expert speakers, Alex Barrows and Molly Morgan from Exawatt, bring a wealth of experience and knowledge in the solar industry, and they will be sharing their insights and expertise to provide you with valuable information. There will be a Q&A session after the presentations, so feel free to express your opinions, share your thoughts, and ask any questions that come to mind. This is a great opportunity to engage with the speakers and fellow participants. So without further ado, let's begin our presentations. Our first speaker today is Alex Barrows. Alex is the head of PV at Exawatt, where he leads the solar PV research team. He has a particular focus on forecasting the efficiency and the cost evolution of solar technologies in order to understand when and how new technologies will influence the PV market. Alex obtained his PhD in the physics of perovskite-based solar cells from the University of Sheffield. So Alex, thank you for joining our session today. You may take the floor and begin your presentation.
Much, Vera. And can I just check that you can see my screen there now? Okay, so assuming that you can, thanks Vera, and thanks everyone for joining us for this webinar. Today I'll give you a brief introduction to Exawatt for those of you that don't know us, and then I'll cover three key topics that we think will be of interest in 2023. So I'm going to be talking about cost, and in particular a focus on how polysilicon prices are likely to evolve, because that's been a big topic over the last few years. We'll be talking about technology, looking at the adoption in particular of TOPCON and heterojunction technologies, and exploring how the manufacturing costs of those technologies have been evolving. And finally, talking about global manufacturing, and in particular with a focus on manufacturing capacity expansions in the USA, driven by manufacturing incentives there, and talking about how manufacturing costs there might compare to, say, Chinese or Southeast Asian manufacturing costs. So just to give a little introduction to Exawatt, we are a UK-based consultancy focused on decarbonization through electrification. Our work spans photovoltaics, power electronics, energy storage, and electric vehicles. And for each of these markets, we study the market by looking at a combination of the supply chain, so manufacturers, capacity, production, and so forth, cost analysis and forecasting. And in particular, we specialize in bottom-up cost analysis, technology forecasting, so a focus on when and how new technologies are likely to influence the market. And finally, demand, so looking at downstream demand and how that's likely to evolve over the coming years. And of course, we look at how each of these things interacts with each other. We publish a series of quarterly reports on each of these topics, and we also undertake sort of bespoke consulting projects for clients. So if you think that any of our data or our analysis might be useful to you or your company, then do please get in touch with us. So to start with, just to set the scene for anyone who isn't so familiar with the cost structure of manufacturing a module, here you can see the typical cost structure for a vertically integrated manufacturer in China or Southeast Asia, for example, in the final quarter, so Q4 of the stated year. And you can see that the cost stack is really dominated by materials. They account for about 80% of the total manufacturing cost, and silicon, glass, and frame are all key input costs there. So for Chinese and Southeast Asian manufacturers, many of the process costs, such as electricity, labor, and depreciation, actually make up a relatively small proportion of the total cost. Although, as we'll see later when we discuss US manufacturing, these costs can still be quite important when it comes to considering the differences between different potential manufacturing locations. And you can clearly see from this graph the very high proportion of cost that was attributable to polysilicon at the end of 2022, driven by very high polysilicon prices. And that brings me on to my first topic for today, which is polysilicon. And on this slide, you can see how polysilicon prices have evolved over the last 6 years or so. Obviously, the high prices that we've been seeing has meant that this has been a key topic over the last 18 months. And the key issue over that period has been an imbalance in supply and demand, which has allowed polysilicon manufacturers to achieve very large profits. So for example, Daco's gross margin in Q3 2022 was around 80%, which compared to typically historical margins might have been more in the 25 to 40% region. Now in December and early January, we saw a lot of volatility in polysilicon prices, a very aggressive price decline and then rebound. That price behavior was partly due to short-term supply and demand effects, changes in inventory levels and so forth around the end of the calendar year and around Chinese New Year as well. Prices have now stabilized a little bit over the last few weeks, and in the near term, we expect prices to stay much more stable. As well as some of those short-term supply and demand effects, we're also now seeing the fundamental supply shortage that there has been over the last 18 months start to ease a little bit as new polysilicon production capacity has come online and started to produce at high volumes. And here we can see Chinese monthly polysilicon production volumes, and you can see that there was a very large increase in monthly production volumes in the second half of 2022, with production growing around 65% from August 2022 through to January 2023. And production is now around double what it was a year ago. So there's been a lot of increase in production volume over the last 6 months or so. However, we do expect the increase in production volumes to slow a little bit now until the next major round of capacity additions are brought online. There should be some increases, but not quite as aggressive as we've seen through the latter part of last year. There are several major polysilicon manufacturing facilities due to come online in the second and third quarter this year. So we think that realistically, significant further price relief is most likely in the second half of 2023. And by the end of the year, we expect polysilicon prices to be in the range of $10 to $20 per kilo, and around $15 per kilo is our most likely case for polysilicon prices towards the end of this year. Looking further ahead, we can see manufacturers are still planning huge increases in capacity. with total poly capacity set to increase fourfold from the end of 2021 to the end of 2024. And given this huge growth in manufacturing capacity, we expect the market to return to a state of oversupply, bringing down prices, as we said, in 2023. And then also again in 2024, we expect prices to fall to around $10 per kilo by late 2024. That's a figure that's based on our expectations for the manufacturing costs for the cost leaders at that time, and a forecast that those leading manufacturers will see their margins return to a more historically typical level. It's possible that if all of this capacity comes online and all of it ramps to high quality production and full utilization rapidly, that we will see even more oversupply than we expect, and that could compress margins even further. So we could see prices fall below $10 a kilo if that does happen. Now, while poly prices are likely to decline significantly during 2023, there will be some other cost increases for ingot and wafer manufacturers. In particular, we think there are some shortages in the high purity quartz that is used for crucible manufacturing for monocrystalline ingot growth. Prices there have been increasing recently, and we expect that trend to continue, so that will offset some of the cost reductions that we'll see from polysilicon this year. There are a couple of additional complications as well with polysilicon prices. So the first is that the price premium for polysilicon suitable for N-type ingot manufacturing could grow. Whether this happens or not will depend on how successful the polysilicon manufacturers are at ramping new production capacity to meet these specifications. At the moment, we don't expect an extreme shortage of this high quality polysilicon, but we do think that there may be a little bit of a growth in the price gap for that polysilicon, and that's built into our forecasts. The other complication here is really a consideration if you are a module buyer in the USA, and that relates to polysilicon sourced from the Xinjiang region, which can't be used for modules that will be sold in the USA due to the US government's UFLPA regulations. As you can see from the graph, capacity expansions outside of Xinjiang for polysilicon are set to outpace expansions within Xinjiang. The region accounted for around 50% of Chinese polysilicon capacity at the end of 2020. That will be down to around 25% by the end of 2024. So obviously there should be a lot of non-Xinjiang polysilicon available for modules going to the US. Much of that polysilicon should have an industry-leading cost structure as well. And for US buyers, the real key here is whether products made using Chinese polysilicon but from outside of the Xinjiang region can get through US customs reliably. And that all depends on how US customs decides to enforce those regulations. So assuming that Chinese polysilicon from a region like Inner Mongolia can get qualified to enter the US and can safely be used for those modules without a risk of detention, there's obviously a large volume of very low cost polysilicon available for those modules. If we end up in a situation where only polysilicon from outside of China is qualified for entry to the US, and where we see a lot of detentions of modules that use Chinese polysilicon, then we could see a much larger price gap build up with that non-China polysilicon for US supply commanding quite a large price premium potentially. So there's a lot of uncertainty in how customs will choose to enforce these regulations going forward, and how strict they will be and what they will detain. And that customs enforcement is really what will determine how this topic evolves over 2023, but it's very likely to change during the course of the year. So if you are buying modules in the US or selling to the US, this is obviously something to keep a keen eye on this year. So moving on to the next topic and thinking about technology trends, we'll take a look at what we expect from mainstream technologies during 2023. And of course, the big shift here is likely to be from PERC cell technology towards TOPCON and heterojunction. So a lot of what we do at Exawatt is looking at when new technologies will influence the market. And the way that we tend to do this is by modeling what we call the should cost for a given technology. So this assumes that each technology is manufactured at a large scale by a leading manufacturer It sets aside things like a cost premium for being a small manufacturer or manufacturing outside of China, for example. And we think this is the best way to compare different technologies using this should cost approach. We tend to think about this from a module level, cost per watt perspective. So not just thinking about, say, the cell processing costs for these different cell technologies, but thinking about the overall, what does this mean for an integrated manufacturer producing ingots, wafers, cells, and modules in-house, so that you can account for the cost per watt savings on input materials like silicon, glass, and frames that you get from a higher efficiency technology. And taking this approach, we've been forecasting that integrated TOPCON manufacturing costs will decline below those of PERC, and that this will drive a major transition in the market. And you can see from this graph that we think by the end of 2022, TOPCON was actually now beginning to reach this point for some leading manufacturers, where it was a similar manufacturing cost per watt for an integrated manufacturer, one of the leading manufacturers, to produce a TOPCON module and to produce a PERC module. And that cost advantage for TOPCON is set to grow over the coming years. And that's particularly as TOPCON cell efficiencies will continue to improve, while PERC cell efficiencies are likely to stagnate. And by the end of 2024, we believe that integrated manufacturers might be producing TOPCON modules at a manufacturing cost of around 0.6 cents per watt lower than for PERC. So given that, and with TOPCON offering system level advantages, so higher efficiency, improved temperature coefficients, and so forth, we're now seeing the start of a major market shift. And this shift is similar to the transition that the market saw with the move from multi-BSF to mono-PERC. Again, that was a situation where the integrated manufacturing cost for mono-PERC fell below that of multi-BSF. So you had manufacturers able to make a premium product, a higher efficiency product that was worth more to module buyers at a similar or even lower manufacturing cost than the current standard technology. And of course, when you have something like that happens, that drives a market-wide transition. You can see an indication of what's coming here when you look at capacity plans for TOPCON heterojunction and other advanced cell technologies, which we've shown here. In the other category here, we have back contact cells, which my colleague Molly will talk a little bit about later as well. And here you can see that TOPCON capacity plans are really driving ahead of heterojunction at the moment. And partly this is because, as we showed on the last slide, heterojunction manufacturing costs at the moment remain meaningfully higher than for TOPCON. And right now we expect that situation to persist. So we believe heterojunction will need to make cost savings beyond those that we've included in our forecasts if the manufacturing cost is to rival TOPCON. And realistically, we think it's likely that heterojunction will need to establish a meaningful lead in efficiency over TOPCON in order to achieve cost parity and in order to rival TOPCON for being the sort of next core technology that's driving the market. Now, that there are some possibilities for heterojunction to achieve cost reductions beyond what we've modeled. So for example, silver usage, of course, is one of the key areas that adds costs for heterojunction. And in our forecasts that we've presented today, so looking at these cost forecasts here, which show heterojunction staying more expensive than TOPCON, we assume that heterojunction transitions to a silver-coated copper paste for the metallization, but we haven't assumed a transition to copper plating in these forecasts. So if we see a transition towards copper plating, that could potentially help heterojunction costs come down closer to TOPCON costs. And we expect to see a lot of interest in 2023 in copper plating technologies as heterojunction manufacturers look to close that cost gap with TOPCON. So here, this is looking at our forecast for cell technology market shares out to 2027. And you can see we expect TOPCON to rapidly become the dominant technology in the market. This is a global forecast. So for the US market, we may see transition lagging a little bit behind initially. And that's because TOPCON and HJT capacity plans are currently dominated by Chinese manufacturing facilities. So the markets that can be served by those manufacturing facilities are likely to see that transition initially, and somewhere like the US may lag behind a little at first. Okay, so our third topic for today is manufacturing capacity outside of China. And in particular, we're going to talk about the US today. Of course, the key driver for establishing US manufacturing capacity is the manufacturing incentives that have been included in the US government's Inflation Reduction Act. You can see here, this is from our bottom-up cost modeling. And again, this models a should cost. So we can see that we expect Southeast Asian manufacturing to be around 5 to 10% more expensive than manufacturing in China. And that Southeast Asian manufacturing is really what's serving the US market today. US manufacturing adds a lot more cost, so something like 40 to 80% increase in cost versus Chinese manufacturing. However, when you include the manufacturing incentives that are included in that Inflation Reduction Act, they look to be sufficient to make US manufacturing cost competitive with Southeast Asia and even with China. And that we believe is true for each step in the value chain. So for ingot and wafer manufacturing, and for cell manufacturing, and for module manufacturing, we believe that the incentives at each of those steps is sufficient to offset the higher costs of manufacturing in the US. Of course, cost isn't the only consideration for manufacturers. So they also need to consider payback time, the timescale to build the facility, and how long these incentives will be around for. So they will be at their full level until 2030, and then they will step down. And as they step down, we are likely to see a return to the situation where US manufacturing is significantly more expensive than Southeast Asian manufacturing, unless something has changed with the supply chains in that period. And manufacturers, of course, have to consider whether they have existing manufacturing facilities in Southeast Asia, for example. So a manufacturer with existing Southeast Asian cell and wafer capacity might consider a US module facility a good way to access some of these incentives, but whilst minimizing capex, minimizing risk, and also avoiding underutilization of some of their existing facilities in Southeast Asia that they've already set up. But overall, the headline here is that we think the incentives should make US manufacturing cost competitive. And that's true even whether we're looking at our low delta case or our high delta case. And just to explain a little bit more about those, they account for uncertainties around things like capex, labor costs, what labor inflation will do over the next few years, because this graph here is shown for 2025. And things like shipping costs as well, which obviously have varied a lot over the last few years. Now, just to show a kind of example of some of the analysis that we do and why there's a fairly large spread sometimes between some of these low delta and high delta estimates. Here we're showing the capex for some module facilities in China and also two in India on the far right, that came online in 2022 or due to come online in 2023. And this is showing the capital expenditure for where we have a breakdown for equipment and then for facilities. And in red, you can see totals where we don't have a split between equipment and facilities from the data that we've got. You can see even within China, where PV manufacturing is obviously very, very well established, there's a meaningful spread in capex between different facilities, especially when it comes to facilities. And the buildings, utilities, and all that capex that isn't manufacturing equipment. And we expect that spread in capex to be even larger in countries where PV manufacturing is less well established, so places like the US. And that's why there's quite a wide range in some cases between our low and high estimates for US manufacturing costs. So on this slide, you can see an example of where the cost increases are for US manufacturing versus China or Southeast Asia. And this is a forecast for ingot and wafer manufacturing in the US in 2025, assuming that we have a facility that has come online and ramped to full utilization. And you can see here that labor and depreciation are really the key cost adders, which is interesting because, as I showed at the start of the presentation, from the point of view of a Chinese manufacturer or a Southeast Asian manufacturer, these are certainly not the largest costs in the module cost stack, but they do make a big difference when it comes to manufacturing in some different locations. So, for example, in the US, labor costs are many times higher than in China and Southeast Asia in many cases. and you may need more shifts of workers as well, which increases labor costs. So as you can see, labor and depreciation are key here. It's not shown here, but in some reports that we've done, we've also modeled what we call an accelerated depreciation schedule. And that's based on an assumption that manufacturers would want to fully depreciate any manufacturing facility that they're building over the period of these incentives that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act. So in that scenario, we assume that buildings and facilities are depreciated over 7 years instead of the typical 20 years. And we depreciate the equipment over 3.5 years to allow for one upgrade or replacement during the life of the facility. So we assume that the facility essentially comes online in 2025 and is shut down again in 2032 when the incentives disappear. In that scenario, depreciation becomes the largest cost adder for this manufacturing, for ingot and wafer manufacturing. It becomes a little bit less clear whether incentives would still be sufficient to offset the extra costs of manufacturing in the US if we assume that's the situation. For cell manufacturing, if we model with the accelerated depreciation scenario, it's actually quite likely that the incentives might not offset the extra costs. But for module manufacturing, even if we assume that accelerated depreciation, our modeling would imply that the incentives should still make US manufacturing competitive. So we're fairly bullish on US module manufacturing and a little bit more cautious on ingot and wafer and cell. If you assume accelerated depreciation, it's a little bit less clear whether the incentives are sufficient. And they are, of course, high capex and a little bit higher risk and take longer to bring online as well for potential US manufacturers. Recently as well, while we're thinking about ingot and wafer manufacturing, there have been some news stories about the possibility that there may be some export restrictions on technologies related to large size ingot and wafer manufacturing and exporting those from China. If restrictions like that are brought in, I think a lot of the impact will depend on the detail of those restrictions. For example, exactly what is and isn't restricted and the timescale for those restrictions coming in. At the moment, we expect that those restrictions would cause delays and would add some cost for potential wafer manufacturers outside of China. We don't think it would necessarily stop wafering being established outside of China, but we think it would make it a little bit harder for those manufacturers and add some extra costs, certainly. So here we are looking at US capacity announcements that have happened since the Inflation Reduction Act. So this doesn't include existing manufacturing capacity in the US. It's just new announcements since that act. At the bottom of each stack, you can see the announced capacity, and then the dashed sections show capacity that has either been announced as under consideration but hasn't been confirmed yet, or rumors that haven't been confirmed yet. And at the top, there is some thin film capacity from First Solar and Toledo Solar as well that has been confirmed. So focusing on the confirmed plans, there's around 30 gigawatts of silicon-based module capacity that has been announced due to come online in the US. For cell, it's around 13 gigawatts, but all of that is part of an integrated manufacturing plan. So at the moment, it doesn't look like there will be any possibility to buy US-made cells. There's around 20 gigawatts of wafer capacity, although obviously it remains to be seen whether this will all come online. And there, it is not all part of an integrated manufacturing strategy. So there may be some opportunity for US cell manufacturers to buy US-made wafers if they are looking to as well. And then obviously we've been talking about the US here, but there's a lot of interest in regionalizing PV manufacturing elsewhere as well. So India in particular is pushing hard through similar to the US, through a combination of tariffs and incentives. Other regions like Europe are also very interested in bringing manufacturing capacity back to their region, but are maybe a little bit less far down the road in terms of policies to support that. There is significant expansion plans outside of China. So if we look here at wafer capacity, wafer capacity outside of China could grow by 500% from the end of 2021 to the end of 2024. But it's important to understand that this is coming from a very, very low base compared to Chinese capacity. So whilst you could see significant expansion outside of China, realistically, Chinese manufacturing capacity as a percentage of total global capacity isn't likely to change enormously over the next few years. So, for example, for wafers, Chinese capacity may fall from around 97% of global capacity to around 95% of global capacity. Now, obviously, production is more important than capacity for market share. But even looking at that, if you were to assume very high utilization for the non-Chinese capacity, so for example, manufacturers in India and in Europe looking to use localized capacity where possible, even then you would only see quite small changes in market share. So the real takeaway as far as global non-Chinese capacity goes is that there's a lot of interest in building these supply chains. There's a lot of interest in building this capacity. We're likely to see significant expansions in the US, in India, and probably to a lesser extent in Europe. But at the moment, we don't see that this will change really the overall makeup of the global market in a fundamental way. So China remains set to stay the dominant force in PV manufacturing unless there is a major geopolitical change over the next few years. So there is room for some growth of non-Chinese manufacturing capacity, but China will really remain the dominant force. So with that, I'll just say thank you very much for listening. If you've got any questions, feel free to get in contact by email, and I'll hand back to Vera, who'll hand over to my colleague Molly, who'll talk to you about some of the trends that we're likely to see in new modules and in global installations over the next year as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Alex, for your insightful speech on the latest technologies and global manufacturing. I especially appreciated your in-depth analysis of the cost and capex of modules made in China and the US. I believe it is of great value for our viewers. So thank you. Okay, now let's welcome our second speaker, Molly Morgan. Molly is a senior research analyst at Exawatt, where she supports the PV team by tracking and forecasting evolutions in solar module efficiency and architecture. She also provides analysis of capacity, production, and financial data for PV manufacturers. Molly has a postgraduate degree in solar cell technology from the University of Sheffield. Today, Molly will be speaking about end demand and new module releases. I'm sure our audience is interested in finding more about it. So Molly, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction, Vera, and thank you again for inviting Exawatt to speak today. I'm going to begin my talk from following on from one of Alex's points, which is that the cost of goods sold of N-type technologies is falling, with TOPCON now beginning to fall below that of mono-PERC for leading manufacturers in our modelling. And heterojunction, on the other hand, has more work to do to reach cost parity with mono-PERC. And this is probably most likely to happen if heterojunction can establish a significant efficiency lead over the other technologies. So let's explore the current module efficiencies of the different technologies. And here is an extract of the Exawatt PV module tracker, which is taken from our Q1 2023 update, which shows the distribution of current efficiencies by technology. On this graph, each column of data points represents different technology category, and each individual data point represents a module series. Within each column, the yellow marker represents the production weighted mean efficiency, which is the average efficiency weighted by our forecasted manufacturer production volumes. And then the crosses at the top of each column represent the maximum efficiency of that given technology. So from this, we can compare monofacial and bifacial module efficiencies for mono-PERC, TOPCON, and heterojunction, and I'll cover XBC on the next slide. And both monofacial and bifacial TOPCON and heterojunction categories offer higher maximum and average efficiencies than mono-PERC, with the N-type technologies currently offering broadly similar efficiencies to one another. And one thing of note within this efficiency distribution spread is that the N-type bifacial categories currently have notably higher max and PWM, which is that production weighted mean, efficiencies than their monofacial counterparts. Now, these unexpectedly high efficiencies for some bifacial modules compared to their monofacial counterparts in the market could be a result of preferential selection, the timing of datasheet releases, and also maybe due to optimistic power bins on some bifacial datasheets. But if we look at the TOPCON technology category individually for a second, Jinko currently dominates the PWM for both the monofacial and bifacial categories, although Jinko's dominance of TOPCON in 2023 will be lower than in 2022. And while Jinko offers a large range of monofacial TOPCON modules with a wide spread of efficiencies, at the time the data was collected, Jinko's bifacial offering was limited to just one high efficiency module series. So therefore, we believe that the high bifacial TOPCON PWM seen here is a reflection of Jinko's choice of module offerings in combination with its current dominance of TOPCON shipments, rather than a reflection of any fundamental advantage of bifacial TOPCON over monofacial. And now I'll turn my attention to the back contact category, which is the far right column on this graph. And in this work here, we refer to it as the XBC category. So in 2022, both ICO Solar and LONGi announced they were commercializing back contact cells through manufacturing processes developed in-house. And on this graph, we've highlighted how LONGi's HBBC, which is hybrid passivated back contact modules, perform in comparison to the remainder of our XBC category. And LONGi's module efficiencies are highlighted on this graph in the navy blue. So as you can see, LONGi's highest efficiency HBBC module tops the XBC category and also outperforms both the heterojunction and the TOPCON categories in our dataset in terms of efficiency. So when we look at the XBC category as a whole, the category currently leads our dataset in terms of both the maximum efficiency and also the PWM. But despite LONGi now offering some modules that offer meaningful efficiency improvements over front and rear contacted rivals, the lead of the XBC category is modest, and the PWM efficiency for XBC is less than 0.2% higher than for bifacial TOPCON. And on top of this, you can see that the spread of the XBC efficiencies shows significant overlap with the other N-type technologies, and with many of the highest efficiency TOPCON and heterojunction module series outperforming the bulk of the XBC category, including many of LONGi's new HBBC modules. So that's a brief look at how the different technologies are performing against each other in terms of efficiency in the market today. And now I'm going to talk a bit about what end demand is for these modules. So this is our short-term PV end demand forecast. And this, where possible, is built based on a country by country or region by region analysis. And our short-term forecast shows strong growth in PV end demand, with end installations of approximately 330 gigawatts for 2023. And it's worth noting that our forecasts here, they're historically revised upwards rather than downwards. So that's something to bear in mind as well, that these might be a little bit conservative. And of the key regions, I'm going to briefly discuss some recent trends of Europe and the US. So starting with Europe, our global end demand forecast for 2022 includes approximately 45 gigawatts of installations in Europe. However, in 2022, there was reported to be approximately 85 gigawatts of modules shipped to Europe from China. And obviously 85, that's significantly larger than our installations estimate. And this would indicate a build-up of inventory in Europe. So with this inventory build-up, any bottleneck with installations in Europe would not appear to be caused by a lack of supply of modules or a lack of demand for installations. Now, when looking at 2023, it remains to be seen what will happen to that inventory that built up in 2022 and whether this inventory will unwind in 2023. And so in early 2023, it's entirely plausible that these installations in Europe will continue to grow, but that shipments may perhaps not be as high as inventories used up. Or alternatively, given the resilience and strength of the PV market, it's also entirely plausible that module demand will be strong enough that shipments to Europe won't be affected by the inventory that was built up in 2022. And there's a lot of uncertainty around this at the moment, but either way, we continue to forecast strong demand in Europe for 2023 and beyond. And now moving on to the US market, as I'm sure many of you are aware and how Alex has already touched on it, there's a lot of disruption in the US market last year following the introduction of the US LPA regulations. But despite demand being strong, the bottleneck on installations in the US was due to the difficulty getting modules into the country. Therefore, our installations forecast for the US for 2022 was decreased from our initial number throughout the year. And this is why you'll notice a decrease in US installations in 2022 from the previous year. But given how strong the PV market is for 2023 and beyond, we forecast that for the US, that growth in PV installations will resume, and this will be a temporary thing. So that's an overview of our short-term end demand forecasts. But how does this compare to our module production forecast? So in our forecast, there's a disparity between module production and installations, with module production naturally sitting higher than installations. But in recent quarters, we've seen the gap between production and installations increase in size, and module overproduction has increased from approximately 15% in 2021 to approximately 25% in 2022. And we believe that this increased gap between the two might be accounted for a combination of the following, which is shipments delays and a buildup of modules in transit, a buildup of manufacturer inventory, particularly in a growing market, delays from production to installations being connected to the grid, and an underestimation of AC to DC conversions for some countries. So I wanted to show you this, as this disparity is mindful to keep in your head when you look at our longer term PV demand forecast as well. So Exawatt's long-term end demand forecast, it comes from a different model to our short-term demand, and this one is based on the growth in global electricity demand and PV penetration into the grid. The long-term forecast doesn't include things like if the world were turned to novel technologies, like for example using PV for hydrogen production, and things like that would be a potential meaningful upside to our forecast in the future. But here we're showing three cases, a high case and then two variations of a base case. And then the table on the right-hand side that explains the parameters that make up the basis of each of the cases. So the high case has a larger percentage of energy generation by 2030 and 2050, whereas the two base cases have the same longer-term endpoints, but the base aggressive case has a more aggressive near-term growth in comparison to the standard base case. So our base case applies approximately 800 gigawatts of annual installations by 2030, with our high case and the aggressive base case implying between sort of 900 to 1,100 gigawatts of annual installations by 2030. So either way, we expect PV demand to grow significantly through the remainder of the decade in all three cases. And this gives lots of scope for manufacturing expansions globally to support this. And from all our cases, 1 terawatt of installations annually by 2030 is looking entirely reasonable. But the next few years, they look likely to trend more in line with our high case here rather than any of the base cases. And it's worth noting that, as I mentioned with our short-term demand forecasts, historically we upgrade these forecasts rather than downgrades. That's also something to keep in mind. And then also you can consider that, as we saw in the previous slide, we've historically seen an overproduction of modules. So when you account for a between 10 to 20% overproduction of modules, you can imagine that it would be entirely reasonable that we'd see production numbers as high as 1.2 terawatts when you consider Exawatt's high case. So I will wrap up on that fairly optimistic end note that PV demand looks strong in the near future and continues to look strong out to 2030. So thank you all for listening.
Hey, thank you, Molly, for sharing your insights on module efficiency by technology and also on demand. And your analysis of the demand trends and predictions for the future of solar energy is incredibly valuable. So thank you, Alex and Molly, again for your excellent presentations. We will now move on to the Q&A session. We have received some excellent questions from our audience, and I would like to, and now Alex and Molly are now back on screen to answer them. So let's get started. So the first question is about the competitiveness of TOPCON heterojunction and IBC technologies. And which do you think will be the most competitive in the near future? And how have these three technologies balanced between efficiency and costs? So Alex?
Yes, I think as I showed, we are pretty optimistic about TOPCon, and we expect that to really start to drive the market over the next few years, because we think essentially the cost will be low and the efficiency will be high. Heterojunction, we're a little bit more cautious on about whether it can meet the cost that TOPCon will be able to. There are opportunities for that, but it will need some technical advancement in terms of things like copper plating, removing the use of indium, or really reducing the use of indium by a very, very large amount. Or it will, and well, possibly, or it will need to really have a meaningful efficiency increase over TOPCon. And as we saw, I think in Molly's presentation, at the moment, TOPCon and heterojunction modules are pretty similar efficiencies. So unless heterojunction can establish a real lead in efficiency, I think we are a bit more cautious about whether heterojunction will be able to really take a large market share. For IBC, I think it's harder to know at the moment, partly because a lot of the back contact production is being done with sort of in-house processes. So Longi and ICO Solar as well have both developed manufacturing in-house. There's a lot less information out there about it, so it's a lot harder for us to model their costs. So we're a little bit unsure there. I can certainly imagine back contact being a major driver of the industry in the future. But I think for the next few years, really, I'm certainly very optimistic about TOPCon.
Okay, so Molly, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think Alex has given a very complete answer there, but I would echo what he said about the efficiency distribution of the technologies, and that given that they're broadly quite similar, and so it would turn to looking at the cost of goods sold of the technologies, and that's where TOPCon really separates itself from the other technologies and puts itself in the front running to be the dominant technology after a major market shift away from mono PERC.
Okay, so let's move on to the second question. So Alex, as a PhD researcher specializing in perovskite solar cells, so what is your outlook on the prospects for developing this technology? And how far away do you think we are from industrializing perovskite solar cell technology?
Very interesting question. I think we will see commercialized perovskite cells, both as single junctions used in sort of building integrated photovoltaics. We'll definitely see those over the next few years, but they won't be, they will be a niche product, essentially. They won't be used that widely. Perovskite and silicon tandems are where I think the real excitement is. I could believe that we will see those commercialized over the next 2 to 4 years, but I'm not sure that we'll really see them driving the market until closer to 2030, realistically. I mean, it's always hard to say with these new technologies. It's hard to model costs at the moment because we don't quite know what the processing route will be, for example. But I think one thing to realize with these as well is that there's been so much in the news, so much around perovskites and the challenges that they have with stability and with long-term stability, that even when these products are efficient enough and they are cheap enough and they can pass all the lifetime tests and the degradation tests, I think it'll take a little while for the market to really be happy and be confident that these products are stable, because there's been so much discussion around their instability and around degradation of them. So I think even when these are commercialized, it'll take a few years really for acceptance of the products to filter through into the market. So I think for that, over the next few years, the big story is this shift towards TOPCON and probably to a lesser extent towards heterojunction. I suspect after that we will see the big story being a shift probably towards some kind of back contact design, and then I think we see the shift towards tandems, either with perovskites or with another material. But yeah, I think that's really towards the end of this decade rather than in the next 2 or 3 years as a big sort of market driving technology rather than just something that's quite niche.
Okay, so you think the biggest challenge facing perovskite technology is its stability, right?
Yeah, well, it's doing it all in the same device. So it's not too hard to make a perovskite device that's very efficient, and it's not too hard to make a perovskite device that's very stable. It's not too hard to make one that you can process easily, but to have all of those things in the same package is quite a challenge.
Okay, thank you very much. So moving on to the third question. Europe, as you mentioned in your presentation, Europe, India, and the US are all attempting to establish local manufacturing capacity for solar PV products. However, like you said, China still currently dominates the solar PV manufacturing industry. And the question is, how much can these countries or regions reduce their dependence on Chinese products, like the raw materials? What is the biggest challenge they face in achieving local manufacturing of PV products?
I think the biggest challenge essentially is in that graph that we showed on, showing just how much more manufacturing in the US compared to in China is likely to cost. So there are challenges there in terms of whether the module buyers, for example, in the US, will they pay more for a US made product, or would a European project developer pay more for a European made module? And I think that's really fundamentally is the challenge. I think we will see a growth in manufacturing capacity in the US, in India, in Europe. But like we said, at the moment, I don't think that's going to really, it's not going to change the shape of the global market fundamentally. China will essentially remain dominant for the next few years. And I don't think that that's likely to change unless we see some big policy changes, in these other regions. And we've certainly not seen that in Europe so far. So yeah, I think we'll see expansion of global manufacturing. We'll see more manufacturing outside of China, but the market is growing so strongly that there is room for US, India, and Europe to grow, quite significant volumes of manufacturing, but for that not really to change the market share that China holds overall in terms of manufacturing capacity. So unless something changes over the next few years, we think China will really remain quite dominant.
So Molly, do you have anything to add to this question?
I will sort of leave all the manufacturing type questions to Alex, as he's very much led Exawatt's analysis of that.
No problem. So the fourth question is also for Alex. And how much time and cost do you think it will take to establish local manufacturing capacity for these countries and regions?
Yeah, the time one is interesting. So some module manufacturing facilities in the US can potentially be established quite quickly, where there already exists an appropriate building, an appropriate site, appropriate grid connections and things like that. We don't think that it takes that long to bring some of that capacity online in the US. For cell manufacturing and the ingot and wafer manufacturing, is much harder to know because people haven't built large facilities to do that in the US in recent years. So exactly how long that will take, it's hard to know. Most of those facilities that are planned are aiming to come online in 2025. I think that's probably realistic, but it may take a bit of time for them to then ramp up to full production as well. That may be a little bit slower than in other regions. You know, there'll be training of operators and training of engineers that needs to happen, things like that. But I think 2025 is realistic for US manufacturing to really be ramping up and getting going. And the costs, the real cost difference between China and, say, the US in terms of establishing these facilities is mostly not on the equipment, for example. It's on things like the buildings and the utilities, grid connections, and sort of waste and things like that. And it can be very specific to the country. So in the US, we think that cost is quite a lot higher. But there may be opportunities in regions like India where that may, you know, that cost difference versus, say, China or Southeast Asia may not be as high.
Okay, thank you very much. And that's all for our Q&A session. Thank you all. Thank you both for joining us today for the Global Solar Market Outlook 2023 webinar. And we hope you found the presentations informative and valuable. In particular, Alex from Exawatt shared with us key technology, cost, and global manufacturing trends. And Molly, also from Exawatt, provided insights into demand in the solar market and new module releases. We'd like to thank Alex and Molly for generously sharing your knowledge with our audience and providing valuable insights to the questions that we and our audience have raised. We at SolarBee appreciate the opportunity to host this webinar and to bring together experts in the field to discuss the latest developments in the solar market. We hope that this webinar has provided you with a better understanding of the global solar market in 2023. And if you have any further questions or would like to learn more about SolarBee or Exawatt and our work in the solar industry, please don't hesitate to reach out to us or to Alex or Molly, and we will be happy to provide you with more information and to answer any questions that you may have. And once again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Vera.
Bye-bye.